right, well, welcome back. You are with Seminary Ridge Museum's coverage of the 157th anniversary of the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg. My name is Pete Miele, Executive Director of Seminary Ridge Museum, here with Kaleb, our Education Coordinator, President Daryl Black, and Codie, our Operations Manager. We're going to be talking for the next bit of time about the barricade of rails and the final stand of the Union First Corps, or the last attack of the Confederate Pender's Division here on the Seminary grounds. One of those really crucial parts of the first day's fighting that tends to be a little bit overlooked. So we're going to be walking down the line talking about different perspectives, what people could see from different areas. We invite you to like this video, comment if you have questions. I'll be looking, and we can address any questions you might have, share with your friends to let them know the interesting content that you're watching today. And so let's start by just kind of talking about what is the barricade of rails. And you can kind of see behind us right here that we have loosely reconstructed what this barricade probably looked like around this time, 4 o'clock in the afternoon on July 1st, 1863. It was a semicircular rail barricade that stretched from roughly where the Schmucker House is today on the south end of campus, out into the swale, the fields here, and then back around to the Krauth House, and we'll be walking up towards the Krauth House in a little bit. But this barricade was ordered to be put up by Abner Doubleday, who's in command of the First Corps after Reynolds' death, about midday on July 1st, 1863, as a precautionary measure that if the Union First Corps needs to fall off their advanced position on McPherson Ridge, that they will have somewhere to fall back to and fight again before retreating back through town. Anybody have anything to add on the construction of the barricade? I think you've done you have some visuals.
Sure. So Abner Small, who was a major in the 16th Maine and ultimately became that regiment's historian, he would later recall the actual construction of this barricade by the men of Gabriel Paul's brigade. And he says, under orders, we hastily threw up a redoubt of earth and fence rails in a circular form just in front of the seminary. In reality, behind the seminary building on the western side of the ridge here. In a later account, he recalled in his memoir, our brigade went around to the western face of the building, and there we threw up a barricade of fence rails and anything else that was handy. The barricade took the shape of a crescent bending to the west. And then he talked about how this landscape owed itself to a defense on this particular piece of the ridge, essentially. Their regimental colonel, Charles Tilden, would ultimately, try to get this on the image there, draw a map in the book Maine at Gettysburg, late 19th century, and here we can see that barricade bending to the west. We would be approximately near its center location there. But that is one man's account of the construction of this barricade. And just to kind of contextualize when this is being built chronologically, Small later recalled as well that he could look up to the seminary cupola and saw a group of officers anxiously pointing off toward the north, probably at about the time that Robert Rhodes's Confederate division is starting to make its advance midday down those fields and roads on the northern side of Gettysburg. So all this is sort of happening simultaneously. Action is picking up to the west to necessitate a barricade, but also he's recognizing that there's an attention being paid to the north. These men will ultimately make their way closer to that action over on Oak Ridge, just about a mile north of us.
Daryl, do you want to bring us up to the where the Union First Corps comes back behind this barricade?
Yeah,
a little bit about Johnston Pettigrew earlier.
Yeah, the afternoon attacks had finally in this sector were successful. Johnston Pettigrew's brigade, Junius Daniel's brigade, just off to the north around the railroad cut, had begun to push the United States line off of McPherson's Ridge and back into this area. Johnston Pettigrew's men, the same fellows who had been across this ground the day before, or at least 3 of the regiments had been across this ground the day before, had fought fiercely in the Willoughby Run Valley, fighting against the Iron Brigade and part of Bidles Brigade along McPherson's Ridge. They're exhausted. As you well know, the 26th North Carolina is beaten up very badly fighting the 24th Michigan. And Pettigrew's men are absolutely exhausted by the fighting. and take the position along McPherson's Ridge as the United States forces retreat across the field. So that's where we are. Dorsey Pender's men are following Abner Perrin's brigade, in particular Alfred Scales' brigade, and then off to the south, James Lane's North Carolina brigade had begun to move forward in support of this last attack by Harry Heath's division, and we're trailing several hundred yards behind, and by the time that Pettigrew's troops had stopped on the ridge, we're in the swale just to the west of the McPherson barge.
Great. So let's talk about the men that are going to inhabit this barricade line, and we're going to start by just looking off to the south where the barricade line begins, and talk a little bit about Bidles Brigade of the 3rd Division of the Union 1st Corps, the 121st, 142nd Pennsylvania, 20th New York State Militia, and then the 151st Pennsylvania, which is roughly where we are right now. But Kaleb has a couple of accounts from the 121st.
Yep, so we have a report from Major Biddle, 121st. He says, here with the broken regiment, or remnants of our other regiments, their defenders defended the fence of the hospital grounds with great determination. Finding the enemy, we're moving out on our left flank with the intention of closing in on our only opening into the barricade. I reported the fact that the division commander, and by his directions, returned to the fence barricade. We have another account from report of Colonel Gates of the 80th New York State Militia, and he says that we held the position until the artillery was removed and then fell back slowly behind the barricade of rails. Here the men were rallied and formed behind the barricade and checked the enemy's advance, and finally compelled him to retire.
Okay, so the enemy advance. Want to talk? I know you love doing Pender's.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Perrin's brigade.
Perrin's brigade is going to spearhead the attack as the United States troops take their position. There's about a 35-40 minute lull from the time that Heath's men drive the United States forces off of McPherson's Ridge until this final attack is made. And as the troops from Dorsey Pender's brigade, or division, begin to move forward, they have a determination that is extraordinary. Abner Perrin is commanding the Sam McGowan's South Carolina Brigade, one of the best fighting brigades in all of Robert E. Lee's army. They had been in some of the fiercest fighting. They were part of A.P. Hill's old light division. They had been the first, in fact, the first South Carolina that attacks right just to the south of where we're standing right now, had been the first regiment that had appeared on the field at the Battle of Sharpsburg when as a part of Hill's light division that had marched up from Harper's Ferry. So they'd been at some of the hottest part of the fighting at the Stony Hill at 2nd Manassas. Really experienced combat veterans, politically very advanced in the secession movement. You have men who had been a part of the secession convention, leading the regiments and serving as officers, staff officers in Perrin's brigade. Sam McGowan had been wounded at Chancellorsville in the fierce fighting that McGowan's brigade had taken part in. Abner Perrin, the colonel of the 14th South Carolina, is promoted to command, and he is in charge of this brigade of South Carolinians on the 1st of July, 1863. Just to the north of where we're standing, and we're standing just at about the point where the 14th South Carolina and the 16th North Carolina from Alfred Scales' brigade connected. To the north is Alfred Scales' North Carolinians. These are largely mountaineers, with the exception of the 13th North Carolina. All of the regiments in Scales' brigade came from either the Piedmont regions of North Carolina or the mountain counties of western North Carolina. Not particularly the strongest Confederates. In fact, they are pretty much the outlier of outliers politically in Robert E. Lee's army. They are men from areas that had been that were strongly Unionist. In fact, an officer from the 16th North Carolina had gone back to North Carolina before the heavy fighting in 1862 and formed a Unionist militia. So these guys are really on the margins of what Robert E. Lee's army was, which was a slaveholders' army. It was from the slaveholding districts of the southern states, the first regiments that were organized during the Confederate mobilization. So you have two very different regiments. You have leading lights of the secession movement next to resistant mountaineers. And the combat that they take part in is fierce and very dramatic. Let's talk about Perrin for just a second. Perrin's South Carolinians move up into the position behind Johnston Pettigrew's troops, and as Pettigrew's troops lay on the ground, they cross over them, and as Admiral Perrin says, they gave a weak cheer for old South Carolina. Perrin was not particularly enamored of the fighting that Pettigrew's men had done. And in a letter written in the latter part of July of 1863 to Governor Bonham of South Carolina, heaps a little bit of criticism on Pettigrew and his men, says that they, like new troops, stood off at a distance and shot and fired at long range. This is contrasted, of course, to what Admiral Perrin says his men did. And what his plan was, and it was very Robert E. Lee, aggressive tactics. He said, I gathered my officers together, told them to have their men fix bayonets and not fire a shot until I gave the word. So you've got 4 regiments of South Carolinians who are instructed to march across this field without firing back at the enemy. And the idea was to get close enough to where they could fire a volley and then make a rush and overwhelm the United States position. And that's exactly what they did. But it wasn't easy. And in fact, it cost the South Carolinians a tremendous number of men and dead and wounded. As they came across the field, not a shot was fired. The artillery began to open up on the ridge, and within a few more minutes, the infantry fire from along this barricade of rails began to take a very strong effect on the South Carolinians. In the area where we're standing right now is where the 14th South Carolina made its advance. They got within about 200 yards. You can see off in the distance, you can see the park bench down there. And somewhere in that area, the 14th South Carolina begins to falter. The 1st South Carolina, the next regiment in line, becomes confused as they cross a rail fence. And as one of the veterans said, we came across the fence and we're a solid mass. Perrin is then looking off to his north, and Perrin is on horseback. He's leading his men from the front. He looks to his north, and he sees Alfred Scales' men begin to stop. Now they're in a much different position than Perrin's men, because they're standing in front of Wainwright's artillery brigade, who opens fire as they begin their advance across the top of McPherson's Ridge, and Scales' men begin to fall just as they come into view of the United States line. They make it to the edge of the, if you can see out here into the distance, you can see the rail fence, and just where that fence ends, it begins to run back towards the Chambersburg Road. And somewhere, depending on whose account you read, somewhere between there and the orchard that you'll see off to the north here, Scales' men go to ground. All of the officers, the field and line or all of the field officers except for 2 had been wounded or killed in that maybe 7 to 10 minute advance across the field. The Scales himself was wounded, and the brigade ground to a halt about between 200 or 75 yards, it depends on whose story you believe, in front of the United States line. The artillery line was massive. The artillery line inflicted incredible damage on Scales' men. By the way, Scales' men are going to go into Pickett's charge 2 days later. Back over here, though, we're looking at Abner Perrin's troops, the 1st South Carolina, the 14th South Carolina, the 1st South Carolina, the 12th and the 13th on the right. They look like they're going to stop, and it is certainly clear that from the reports that the 14th South Carolina falters, the 1st South Carolina becomes somewhat confused, and it takes some pretty serious work on Perrin's part to get the men moving again. He still hasn't given the order to fire, by the way. So, as you see this confusion here down in the bottom of the swale, had we been standing here 157 years ago, we would have seen Abner Perrin ride his horse in front of the line, So he's between his men and the barricade of rails. Get the 14th South Carolina, his old regiment, up and moving. Reorganize the 1st South Carolina and recognize a tactical opportunity. He looks to the south. He can see the end of the barricade of rails. He notices that there is a thinness in the line down there. Once you get beyond the barricade of rails, you're looking at largely cavalry troopers who are behind the stone wall around the Schmucker house. And he makes a quick decision. He sends the 14th South Carolina straight against the rail barricades. He then sends the 1st South Carolina obliquely to the south to get around the end of the barricade line. And then he sends the 12th and the 13th South Carolina farther south towards the Fairfield Road and the Schmucker house to attack the gap in the line, or attack the weak spot in the Union line. And it works. Now remember, this all happens in what? 15 minutes at most.
Doesn't take too long to get across that field.
And it doesn't get across, yeah, it takes just about 10 minutes to walk across that field at quick step. And the attack is successful. The 1st South Carolina gets on the end of the line. If you're a soldier from the 151st Pennsylvania, it looks like they're marching single file, but they're actually marching obliquely in line of battle. They stop, they front, they wheel into line, and they fire 2 volleys before the United States troops know they're there. The 12th and the 13th South Carolina continue farther to the south. They break through that line, the Union line down at the Schmucker house, and then the Union line along the barricade begins to fall apart, and the retreat back towards Gettysburg starts.
So one of the questions that we got, one of the comments that we got on Facebook from our friend Kevin is, what did the barricade of rails look like? Was it this high in 1863? And the answer is kind of roughly. We don't really have much of an account of how high it was. I've seen knee high. I've seen that one of the accounts that I read this morning, that soldiers could lie behind it and fire. And a lot of people who are writing about the barricade talk about its makeup. George McFarland, commander of the 151st, says that it has stumps and rails, etc. I just was looking at another account. I believe it's from William Robinson, says that it was put up rather hastily, so it's not really not necessarily a well put together fortification. It was something that was thrown up, and it was probably, its lifespan was probably measured in a period of hours, from about midday on July 1st, and then probably by the nightfall, or maybe a little bit after July 1st to July 2nd, it's probably moved to the other side of, or parts of it are moved to the other side of the ridge for the Confederate breastwork. So that gives a little bit of a illustration of what this looked like. Do you have something to add?
Yeah, William Ray, who was a veteran of the 7th Wisconsin, in his diary, he does give us a brief measurement here. He says, after they flanked us, talking about the first time, we had to fall back, and they kept flanking us, and we kept falling back till we got behind the breastwork of rails. Being only 2.5 feet high, so we got behind it and just mowed the Rebs. All in front of our regiment was just mowed down. But their line being the longer, they kept swinging around the end and getting a crossfire on us, and we had to abandon that place. So 2.5 feet, goes up to mid-calf or so, maybe up to knee-high at its tallest.
Depends on how tall you are.
Exactly, yeah, it all depends on how tall you are. I do think an interesting point as well is just to get a sense of what this landscape physically looked like. It would have been a bit more wooded than it is today. It's one of those rare places at Gettysburg where there would have been probably more foliage than there is today. The barricade is made really kind of right on the edge of that tree coverage. So around where we are located right now, where it's this kind of park or picnic grove-like atmosphere, this would have extended the bulk of Seminary Ridge. Not a whole lot of underbrush, just this kind of grassy floor of the surroundings with this broad canopy of foliage above us. And the materials for this barricade, as we've talked about, are utilized throughout the day, just building it with what's handy. And a lot of times this will be fence rails, felling trees, as Pete just mentioned, stumps. And if you look at some photographs of the seminary grounds after the battle, of the Chambersburg Pike after the battle, you can notice that in many instances there are just posts stuck in the ground, but the rails of post and rail fence are missing. And this might be some indication of some of these local areas where they would have been pulling some of these rails from to build this hastily constructed position just a couple of 100 yards long from end to end.
Does anybody want to comment on the smoke? You know, we talk about perspectives and we talk about what people could see, but you know, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the smoke that's coming from the small arms fire, the smoke that's coming from the 21 artillery pieces that are up on the roadway. And anybody want to comment on any of that?
Okay. With this being a wooded area, to kind of segue off of that, this is a span that will trap a lot of this smoke. Of course, it's a black powder war, so it's going to be extremely messy, dirty air. And much the same thing that happens at McPherson's Ridge, where through Herbst Woods, through the ravine near Willoughby's Run, you'll read these accounts of soldiers who almost have to get on their hands and knees effectively to make sure that they're kind of going in the right direction. There will be some accounts of that here. I believe Colonel George McFarland of the 151st Pennsylvania, in his official report, talks about stooping down at one point, which will lead ultimately to his own wounding through each leg. One account that really speaks to this smoke and this melee is Corporal Robert Beecham of the 2nd Wisconsin, part of the Iron Brigade, just to my left, the viewer's right. He said, almost at the same moment, as if every lanyard was pulled by the same hand, this line of artillery opened, and Seminary Ridge blazed with a solid sheet of flame, and the missiles of death that swept its western slopes no human beings could endure. After a few moments of the belching of the artillery, the blinding smoke shut out the sun and obstructed the view. We of the infantry fell into line between the artillery sections and assisted with our musketry, keeping up the fire until our pieces grew hot in our hands, and the darkness, as of night, had settled upon us. Not a Confederate reached our line. This was, of course, after the first assault. He continued, after we ceased firing and the smoke of battle had lifted, we looked again, but the charging Confederates were not there. Only the dead and dying remain on the bloody slopes of Seminary Ridge. So it's to the point that, as he says, it's blinding. It almost feels like it's night through this thick tree growth, as all of these artillery pieces, almost 24 of them, are going off at the same time. 3 brigades of infantry firing toward this advancing Confederate line, over top of the barricade of rails, under the canopy of foliage, in the faces of Confederate troops just a couple 100 yards distant, all happening in a relatively close period at the same moment. And it's just going to create this absolute havoc where men can't see what's happening around them for but a few feet.
Why don't we take a walk down? I think that's a good segue to talk about Stevens Battery. We'll take a little walk here if we can. We've got all of our stuff. And we'll talk about the Iron Brigade. Caleb, do you want to say a little bit about the Iron Brigade position, which would have kind of held, the remnants of the Iron Brigade are holding the position, sort of what we're walking through as we make our way back up to the crest of the ridge. And you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, so they're going to hold this section of the line. They're going to see intense fighting earlier in the day over on McPherson's Ridge, and eventually have to fall back this direction and fall in line with the rest of the United States soldiers here on this western side of Seminary Ridge. They're going to face just as intense fighting here later in the day behind this barricade, and eventually fall back with the rest of the Union line. But the Union line here holds much better than on than on the northern or the southern end of the line, because they do have this artillery support, which is vacant here closer to the southern end. So that's really going to assist them in repulsing this wave after wave of Confederates, and what is eventually going to force that Confederate line to shift off to our south. So yeah, that's all going to play a role here. They're going to hold well until, unfortunately, they're just going to basically be enveloped by the Confederate line wrapping around to their south.
So one of the questions that we've got on Facebook, and I'll throw it out to the group, what are the weather conditions like on July 1st, 1863? And
cloudy and close.
Depends on where you are.
Yeah,
Depends on where you are.
But at this point, it's cloudy and close. It's about 80 degrees, 78 degrees or so. Overcast, very humid.
And one of the things that we like to think about here, and again, this is a perspective. The Civil War happened outside. These men, many of the men that are going to fight here, have marched in some cases up to 10, 12 miles before they even get to battle. And in some cases, there are men from the 11th Corps, I know the 153rd Pennsylvania, before they go into line of battle on Barlow's Knoll, talk about coming through some of the worst rainstorm that they had seen on that morning. The men of Bidles Brigade wake up on the morning of July 1st down by White's Crossroads, and they talk about how they're covered in dew and that there had been a light rain the night before. But if you were west of town,
if you were west, if you're in Harry Heath's division, if you're in Abner Perrin's brigade of South Carolinians and in Dorsey Pender's division, you would have woken up to a fairly pleasant morning. One of the artillerymen from Heath's division wrote about sitting on the lumber chest, smoking his pipe, feeling the pleasant breeze coming across the fields on a sunny morning on July 1st. So anybody who's spent much time in Gettysburg knows that you can be a couple of miles away from a raging thunderstorm and have beautiful skies above you. It's just there are anomalies of weather that are coming off of the mountains that lead to some very interesting weather or micro weather experiences in the Gettysburg area. One of the things, talking about this marching, the advance of Perrin's brigade was described by one of the veterans of the brigade as being the most, they're following in line of battle, which is a difficult thing to do, through up and down the hills and through forests and out into the fields, and trying to keep your alignment, not knowing if you're going into combat almost immediately. And they said it was the hardest march of the entire war. So the hours leading up to the attack that these guys make is some of the most trying marching that Perrin's troops did over the course of the entire war.
Great. What was I going to talk about here?
I hope you're going to talk about the Iron Brigade. You're going to talk about some Wisconsin guys.
Yeah, but I had a question that I was going to throw out, and I just lost it. Wow, I'm getting old.
Just keep waiting.
Yeah, it's going to get worse. Well, and one of the questions that we had from Sean, who watches a lot of our videos, was were any of the buildings damaged? And so there were only 3 buildings that were here on the seminary grounds in 1863, and in fact, if Rob can just pan over a little bit right here, you can see one of the better preserved buildings that was here, the home of Charles Kraut, at least on the outside better preserved, the home of Charles Kraut, who was one of the 3 professors here in 1863, and we know a lot about the damage that some of these buildings would have seen from the report that Samuel Simon Schmucker gives to the board of the seminary following the battle during the regular seminary board meeting in August. And he says that Kraut's house was relatively unscathed compared to the main seminary building, home of the museum today, which had most, if not all, of the windows blown out, 2-story crack in the building, the northwest corner gable had to be rebuilt, and then Schmucker's own house was specifically targeted probably by men of Perrin's brigade, who went into Schmucker's house and threw all his books and papers promiscuously over the floor and out the windows, to take their aggression out on Schmucker for being such a vehement opponent of slavery, a view that he had honed over a period of about 30 years as he's president of this institution. So yeah, all 3 buildings experienced some damage to varying degrees. All 3 are going to be used as hospitals or hospital treatment centers during the aftermath of the battle. And even Schmucker says in November of 1863 that it's really, they're only just now sort of getting their lives back together after all of this damage that was incurred. I remembered what I was going to say.
Wow.
See, I keep talking and it just comes around. The artillery line. So we've been referencing this 20.
I said that's what you were going to talk about.
Did you?
Yeah.
Okay. The 21 guns.
Not only can't you remember, you
I can't hear. What?
Huh?
Who said that? The 21 guns of artillery, we've referenced that a couple of times. Anybody want to go into a little bit more detail about the 21 guns? Take it away.
The Union First Corps line of artillery on McPherson's Ridge, just like the infantry for a good bit of the day. And I think one of the interesting things as these guns are pulling back earlier in the afternoon is that in some instances there's a confusion over the term Seminary Ridge versus Cemetery Hill or Cemetery Ridge.
Happens today, too.
It still happens today, exactly. These two terms are, of course, very similar. And when you're dealing in the course of the 11th Corps, where there are a lot of German Americans, there's sort of a language barrier. It comes up in some accounts. In other accounts, it's just the confusion of battle. And so the initial artillery pieces that are pulled back off of McPherson's Ridge, in some instances, I believe James Hall's battery is one of them, where he thinks that the order was actually to maybe keep going, but stops at Seminary Ridge. So it's partly by accident in some instances that some of this artillery does stop here. But by the time we see the Confederate advance coming across this position and the attack against Seminary Ridge has begun in earnest, this entire line for a couple hundred yards would have been filled with, as we mentioned, the 21 guns that are almost wheel to wheel in some instances. Several sections of cannon, one of which a cannon today marks the position of Greenleaf T. Stevens' 5th Maine Battery. And it will be these batteries, especially in this vicinity, that, as Daryl talked about, the advance of Alfred Scales' brigade, North Carolinians, that would just mow down their front. And we mentioned Robert Beecham's account, where he says it felt like every lanyard was pulled at once whenever this attack was first made, and this entire landscape just would have been filled with artillery fire for the next couple of moments. Some really vivid accounts come out of this. This is one of those locations on the Gettysburg battlefield where it seems every man who was in its vicinity wrote something really colorful, really interesting about what this meant on both sides. If you're a Confederate soldier, you're talking about how your lines were withered. If you're a United States soldier, you're talking, as Beecham did, about how it just feels like no one is there, and then the smoke clears and the second attack comes along. I think it is worth mentioning as well that this line will extend a little bit beyond the Chambersburg Pike. There are going to be cannon on the other side of modern-day Route 30. We can see the cars traveling and the white fence in the vicinity of the Mary Thompson house there. You're going to have the Iron Brigade in this general area, supported by some of the artillery here, like Stevens Battery. And then on the northern side of the road, we have as well Roy Stone's Pennsylvania Bucktail Brigade, and through the highway, and then to the northern side of it, with additional artillery support there. So we're talking about thousands of men, almost 24 pieces of artillery in a rather condensed space.
And it's kind of important to think about the scale of this. So an artillery battery, a 6-gun artillery battery, this in line to fire, takes up a football field, 100 yards and across, because you've got the guns. The guns are the front of the battery. Behind that, you have the limbers with a 6-horse team drawing in, and then another 10 yards behind that, you're going to have the caissons drawn by another 6 horses. So imagine you've got these guns that are already at half intervals. By regulation, they're supposed to be 15 yards between the hubs of each gun, and that's because that's the way that you can move the guns around. The limbers pull the guns, so you have to pull to go into battery. You have to have room to move these big wheeled vehicles around. So it's always astonishing to me to think, when the Union line finally breaks, how difficult it was to get Wainwright's brigade of artillery off of this position, because they don't have the room to run the horses and run the teams the way that they're supposed to. Getting off the ridge must have been an absolute nightmare for these gunners. But Wainwright says we started off at a walk. You can get, you got your horses going at a walk. He said we didn't want to upset the infantry. We didn't want to make them think that this was too hasty of a retreat. And so here the guns go down, slowly down the backside of the ridge.
And when we walk as we're talking about this,
slowly down the backside of the ridge, and as the Union line begins to collapse from the north, the horses begin to move faster. And he has the men, by the time they're down at the bottom of the swale on the other side of Seminary Ridge, he's got them going in a trot or a run. as they're going back towards East Cemetery Hill. It had to be absolute chaos up here.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one thing as well, just briefly to mention, that's happening when you have this number of men in such a tight quarters that they're rather unused to, given the circumstances, is the orchard in the near the bottom of the ridge, kind of in the swale. You have some of these soldiers kind of taking respite for a moment. This was toward the beginning of the attack in the orchard itself. And I believe it's John Kaleb of the 7th Wisconsin talks about how the artillery being so close behind them over this rather gentle rise, it's not steep by any means, especially on the defense, where this artillery has to sort of fire over the tops of these men. And he talks about how some of the branches are coming down from the orchard trees, how this artillery fire is kind of wreaking havoc into the almost the backs of his own men. And this is an instance which we'll see play out again at Culp's Hill the next day, or the morning of July 3rd. And it becomes kind of a frustrating matter for some of these infantrymen.
And I think we have a good quote here that kind of goes alongside of that. It's from Stevens of the main battery here at Gettysburg. He says, "The whole line of battle from right to left was one continuous blaze of fire, the space between the two ridges completely filled with the thin blue smoke of the infantry, making it difficult to distinguish friend from foe, while the artillery from their higher position breached forth with a tremendous fire of shot and shell, moving their deadly missiles in rapid succession into the ranks of the enemy advancing on our direct front, covering themselves for the moment in dense clouds of white smoke. Our infantry, by the overwhelming numbers of the enemy, 5 to 1, were forced back upon a line with the artillery, some of them crouching under the very muzzles of the gun of the 5th Maine battery to avoid its fire." So that's the battery that's going to be placed here on this ridge, right where we're standing.
A little visual here. This is from 1889. It is a little grainy, but this would have been from the perspective of the other end of the ridge, near the Union left flank. But we can see the seminary cupola a little bit out of scale. But it gives us a nice sense of kind of looking down the Union line. We can see the smoke coverage in the distance. We can see what I believe might be the Krauth House in the distance there. And we can see the Confederate advance coming from the left. So I think a good, in minute scale, an artist's interpretation of how cloudy this fight would have been, as we've talked about with the artillery, with the tree coverage, with the smoke that is commencing in this general vicinity. And on the note of the buildings here, since we're even nearer to the Krauth House, there's a student named Francis Hoover who enters the seminary on when the classes resume, about 2.5 months after the battle. And on September 26th, he writes a letter home to his fiancée in New York, and he describes the buildings around Gettysburg, and we would presume he means these as well, almost look like they went through nutmeg graters. So it's a homespun, kind of crude interpretation, but probably not far off. He said this vicinity, one of the things that was noticeable was that the bones of horses were sticking up from the ground. Artillery, of course, takes a lot of horses to pull, so we can probably make the educated guess that a lot of the horses whose bones are still here months after the battle in this general area are as a result of this vast line of artillery. Some of those artillery units would later report and recall that as they pulled off of Seminary Ridge, they're pulling some of these guns off by hand in many cases, because there are not enough animals, enough horses or mules to pull them along.
Anybody have any final thoughts? We're gonna take a little break here, and we're gonna pick up again in a few minutes with another video where we talk about what happens to this seminary ground after the Union Army retreats back to Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. And we're going to talk about this as the Confederate Nerve Center. But any final closing thoughts? No? All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us to talk about the final attack here on the seminary grounds and the barricade of rails. We're here from Seminary Ridge Museum with our 157th anniversary, the Battle of Gettysburg coverage. Pete Miele with Codie, Kaleb, and Daryl here. And we'll be back again on our Facebook page at just about 5 o'clock in about 20 minutes to talk about the Confederate Nerve Center. So we hope that you'll join us for that. Hope to see you on the Ridge soon.